Bruce Carter was the kind of man who commanded a room without saying a word. At 45, the owner of a financial empire, he was known for his cold demeanor in business and his impeccable elegance. His tailored suits were more than just clothing, they were armor. He had built his success on calculated decisions, often at the expense of relationships discarded as if they were underperforming assets. That evening, Bruce sat in an upscale Manhattan restaurant, surrounded by muffled conversations and the clinking of fine wine glasses. Seated alone at a reserved table, he reviewed reports on his tablet. Work was his constant companion, a reminder that for him, there was no distinction between leisure and productivity. As his eyes scanned financial projections, something out of his disciplined routine interrupted him. He heard the sound of the restaurant door opening, accompanied by soft laughter. Instinctively, he looked up. That's when he saw Chloe. The world seemed to slow down. Time had not been unkind to her, but it had changed her. Her once long, flowing hair now fell in controlled waves over her shoulders. The fine lines around her eyes hinted at stories Bruce did not know, but her confident posture and the way she tucked her hair behind her ear were unmistakable. Chloe. Her name echoed in his mind like a long-forgotten melody. Beside her stood a young man, around 22 years old, who soon caught Bruce's attention. He was tall, with brown hair and penetrating eyes that sent a chill through Bruce. There was something disturbingly familiar about that face. The unassuming smile, the way he took in the surroundings, it was as if Bruce were looking at a younger version of himself. Bruce tried to refocus on his tablet, but his concentration was shattered. Chloe's presence, coupled with the young man, created a palpable tension in the air. A connection Bruce couldn't name drew him toward them. For the first time in years, Bruce hesitated. He wasn't one to second-guess his instincts, but something about this moment felt perilous. After minutes of internal debate, he set the tablet aside and stood, his legs moving as if by their own will. He approached their table, his normally unshakable heart beating unevenly. When he was just a few steps away, Chloe finally looked up. Her expression changed, hitting Bruce like a physical blow. Surprise was followed by something colder, cutting him deeply. "Chloe," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's really you." She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze swept over Bruce like a blade, analyzing him, weighing him, before she finally spoke, her tone dry. "Bruce Carter." What a surprise. The young man beside her looked between Chloe and Bruce, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. "Mom, who is he?" Bruce opened his mouth, but Chloe was quicker. "No one, Tim. Just an old acquaintance." "No one?" Bruce echoed, feeling the sting of her words. "Chloe, who is he?" His gaze shifted to the young man as his mind began to piece together an impossible puzzle. Chloe took a deep breath, her posture rigid. "This is Tim. My son." The ground seemed to vanish beneath Bruce's feet. The world spun, but he stood firm. He looked back at the young man and finally saw clearly what he had already suspected. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was like looking at a younger version of himself. "Your son?" The words barely escaped his lips. "Yes," Chloe replied, her voice sharp. "The son you never cared to know existed." The silence that followed was as heavy as the air before a storm. Tim turned to Chloe, confusion clouding his face. "Mom, what are you saying? You've never mentioned this before." Chloe turned to her son, her voice tinged with a pain she tried to conceal. "Because you didn't need to know. He left us, Tim. He never cared." Bruce took a step forward, his instinct to defend himself overriding his disbelief. "Chloe, I didn't know. I never knew." "Spare me," she snapped, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You were too busy chasing your precious career to care about what you left behind." Tim stood, still processing the heated exchange. "Mom, I need to understand this. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Chloe avoided his gaze, her lips tightening. "Because you didn't need him. We never needed him." Bruce tried to speak again, but Chloe raised a hand to silence him. "Don't think you can just walk into our lives now. There's nothing you can say to change the past." With that, she grabbed her bag and headed for the door, leaving Bruce standing there, drowning in shame, regret, and a hollow emptiness he had never known. Bruce couldn't sleep that night. His spacious bed and the luxury of his apartment offered no comfort. Chloe's words echoed in his mind like an endless accusation, "The son you never cared to know existed." He stared at the dark ceiling, trying to comprehend how something so monumental had gone unnoticed for so long. He had always prided himself on his control over life, yet now he felt lost. By morning, Bruce was sitting in his armchair, holding an untouched glass of whiskey. The panoramic view of the city, which usually inspired him, felt barren, almost desolate. He thought of Chloe, her youthful smile, and the way she could light up a room with her energy. He had left her without looking back, convinced that his dreams of greatness were more important than any relationship. Now he realized he had abandoned something far more valuable. Determined to learn more, Bruce hired a private investigator, a tool he often used in business but now for a deeply personal purpose. He wanted to understand the life Chloe and Tim had led without him and find a way to make amends. When Bruce discovered where Chloe lived, he hesitated. Facing her again was daunting, but he knew he had to try. He drove to her modest house and sat in his car, gathering the courage to ring the doorbell. When Chloe opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to restrained exhaustion. "You just don't give up, do you?" "Chloe," Bruce began, his voice low. "Please, let me come in. I just want to talk." Reluctantly, she opened the door just enough for him to enter. The cozy house was a stark contrast to Bruce's world. He noticed photos of Tim on the walls and school trophies on a shelf. Each detail was a stark reminder of everything he had missed. "Make it quick," Chloe said, crossing her arms. "Tim isn't home." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Bruce said, trying to steady his voice. I didn't know about Tim." "Chloe, I swear I didn't." She laughed bitterly. "And if you had? Would you have stayed? Would you have given up your great career to raise a family?" Bruce opened his mouth to protest but stopped. She was right. Back then, he probably wouldn't have stayed. He had been too selfish, too young to understand what truly mattered. "I can't change the past," he finally said, his tone more sincere than he expected. "But I want to be part of Tim's life now, if he'll let me." "You think a few pretty words and some money will fix everything?" Chloe stepped closer, her voice sharp. "I did it all alone, Bruce. Everything. You have nothing to offer." "I know," he replied, his voice breaking. "And I'm not trying to replace what you've done. I just want to get to know him. Please, Chloe. Give me this chance." She hesitated, her eyes scrutinizing him. "I'll talk to him. But let me be clear, if you hurt him, Bruce, I will never forgive you." "I won't," he promised, the pain evident on his face. "I swear I won't." When Chloe closed the door behind him, Bruce took a deep breath. He had taken the first step. Now, it was up to Tim. Bruce Carter couldn't get Chloe and Tim out of his mind. The dinner at the restaurant, the shock of seeing them together, and above all, Chloe's accusatory gaze haunted him. For the first time in years, he faced something his money, power, and influence couldn't fix. He was confronting a past he had ignored, believing that everything in life was replaceable. That morning, Bruce sat in his private office, surrounded by glass walls offering a panoramic view of Manhattan. Normally, this scene was a testament to his achievements. But that day, the city lights felt distant and lifeless. He pushed aside the papers on his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a photo album he hadn't touched in years. Flipping through its worn pages, he found a picture that made him pause. He and Chloe stood side by side, smiling under the sun of a university afternoon. She held his hand confidently while he gazed at the camera with a grin full of youthful certainty. The contrast between the optimistic young man in the photo and the man he had become hit him like a blow. As much as he wanted to justify himself, Bruce knew Chloe was right. If he had known about the pregnancy, would he have stayed? Would he have given up his ambition? He wanted to believe he would have, but the harsh truth was that he had been too selfish. Meanwhile, in Chloe's modest home, tension was also high. Tim sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped under his chin. His mind was racing with questions, but his mother avoided his gaze. Chloe knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "Mom," Tim began, breaking the silence. "Why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Chloe took a deep breath before answering. "Because I thought it was best for you. Bruce, wasn't the kind of man you could rely on. I didn't want you to be disappointed. And you thought hiding everything was better?" Tim's voice carried a mix of hurt and confusion. "I had the right to know." "I know," she admitted. "And maybe I was wrong. But everything I did was to protect you." Tim didn't respond immediately. He stood, grabbed his backpack, and left the kitchen. Chloe remained still, the weight of decades of decisions pressing down on her shoulders. The next day, Tim made a decision. He wanted answers, and only one person could provide them. Using the phone number Bruce had left with his mother, he sent a brief, direct message, "Can we talk?" Bruce received the message during an important meeting. The moment he saw Tim's name, he forgot everything around him. Excusing himself, he left the room and called back immediately. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown that afternoon. When Bruce arrived, Tim was already there, seated in a corner. He looked uncomfortable, fiddling with his phone as he waited. Bruce approached slowly, trying not to seem nervous. "Tim," he said as he sat down. "Thank you for meeting me." Tim looked up, scrutinizing Bruce. "I want to know what happened. Why did you leave? Why didn't you ever try to find us?" Bruce swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his son's words. He hesitated before responding, the sincerity in his voice surprising even himself. "I was young and selfish, Tim. I thought I needed to conquer the world before considering anything else. And when I left, I never imagined I was leaving something so important behind." "Did you know my mom was pregnant?" Tim asked, his gaze unwavering. "No," Bruce replied firmly. "I didn't. If I had, I don't know if it would have been different, but I want to believe I would have tried to do the right thing." Tim nodded, processing his father's words. "And why now? Why are you trying now?" Bruce leaned forward, his eyes filled with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. "Because I saw you, Tim. And I realized what I missed. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your present, if you'll let me." The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. Finally, Tim nodded, his voice low but firm. "I'm not ready to forgive you, but I think we can start with this." Bruce smiled, a mix of relief and hope. "That's all I'm asking for." When their conversation ended, both left the cafe with a sense of possibility. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. Chloe watched Tim grow increasingly curious about Bruce. Although he remained cautious, there was a spark in his eyes she hadn't seen before. It was as if Bruce's presence had filled a gap in his life, a gap Chloe had tried her best to fill. This left her in a state of constant unease. One evening, Chloe sat in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. Tim, who had rarely shown interest in it before, now spent hours poring over its pages. Among pictures of birthdays and vacations, there were a few of Bruce, photos Chloe had kept for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Tim seemed fascinated by them, as if searching for answers in every detail. "You never talked much about him," Tim said, breaking the silence. He didn't look at her as he spoke, but the weight of his question hung in the air. "Because there wasn't much to say," Chloe replied, keeping her tone steady, though she knew it wouldn't end the conversation. Tim finally looked up, his gaze piercing. "Did he really not know about me? Or did you choose not to tell him?" The question hit Chloe like a wave. She took a deep breath, feeling tension in every muscle. "I made that decision because I thought it was best for both of us. He wasn't the kind of man who would have stayed, Tim. He was obsessed with success, and I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you were an obligation. But don't you think I should have had the chance to decide that for myself?" Tim countered, his voice carrying a mix of hurt and determination. Chloe hesitated but knew he was right. "Maybe. But at the time, I just wanted to protect you. Everything I did was for you." Tim shook his head and closed the album. "I just want to understand who he is. I'm not choosing him over you, Mom. I just want answers." Those words offered Chloe a small relief, but the fear of losing her place in her son's heart still lingered. She knew Tim needed to explore this part of his story, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. In the days that followed, Chloe saw Bruce making genuine efforts to connect with Tim. He was persistent but not overbearing, arranging meetings at cafes and sending simple but thoughtful messages. For Tim, it felt like discovering a part of himself he never knew existed. For Chloe, it was a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she feared losing. One night, after seeing Tim leave for another meeting with Bruce, Chloe decided it was time to confront the man who had once again turned her life upside down. She knew where he and Tim usually met and decided to go there. When she arrived at the small cafe, she found Bruce sitting alone, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when he saw her, visibly surprised. Chloe stood at the entrance, hesitating for a moment before walking over. "Can we talk?" she asked, crossing her arms in a defensive gesture. Bruce nodded, setting his phone aside. "Of course." They walked to a nearby park, where tall trees and the quiet of the night provided the privacy they needed. Chloe stopped near a bench and turned to Bruce, her expression hard. "Do you think this will fix everything?" she asked bluntly. "That spending time with Tim will erase the years you were absent?" Bruce sighed, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "No. I don't think I can erase anything, Chloe. I just want to try to do something right now." "You don't understand, Bruce," Chloe continued, her voice full of emotion. "I watched Tim grow up. I was there for every moment, every achievement, every failure. He is who he is because of me. And now you show up, as if you can be the hero of the story." Bruce kept his gaze steady on Chloe. "Chloe, I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I know I can never be what you were to him. But he deserves the right to decide. He's an adult now." Chloe felt a lump in her throat. She knew he was right, but admitting it was difficult. "If you hurt him, Bruce," she said, her voice trembling, "I will never forgive you. And neither will he." "I know," Bruce replied sincerely. "And I promise I won't." There was a moment of silence between them. Chloe looked at Bruce, trying to see beyond the man who had abandoned her. There was a sincerity in his eyes that she didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. When she returned home, Chloe realized something she hadn't admitted even to herself. As much as she still harbored resentment, a small part of her wanted to believe that Bruce could truly change. Tim was hesitant when he accepted Bruce's invitation to spend the weekend with him. Although their recent conversations had been polite and even pleasant, he still felt an emotional barrier. It was hard to ignore the years of absence and the stories his mother had told him about the man now trying to be part of his life. Chloe, on the other hand, was apprehensive. Watching him pack his bag on Friday night, she resisted the urge to ask him not to go. Instead, she limited herself to a simple warning: "Be cautious, Tim." He nodded silently, understanding how difficult this was for her too. On Saturday morning, Bruce arrived punctually, driving an elegant but understated car. He stepped out and opened the door for Tim, a small but meaningful gesture. As Tim placed his bag in the back seat, Bruce tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "What did you pack? Looks like you're staying for a month." "Books. I have an essay to finish," Tim replied curtly. Bruce smiled, unfazed by the defensive tone. "No problem. I can find you a quiet place to work. Promise I won't bother you." The drive to Bruce's apartment was almost palpable with silence, interrupted only by occasional small talk about trivial topics like traffic and the weather. When they arrived, Bruce showed Tim around the apartment carefully, avoiding overemphasizing its luxurious features. He wanted his son to feel comfortable, not overwhelmed. That afternoon, Bruce suggested a walk in a nearby park. "It's where I go to clear my mind," he said. Tim hesitated but agreed. The park was peaceful, with tall trees and well-kept trails. As they walked, Bruce began talking about his youth, something he rarely did. "When I was your age, I used to go to a park like this to think about everything I wanted to achieve. I was so obsessed with success that I barely noticed what was around me." Tim looked at his father, intrigued by the honesty. "You got what you wanted, didn't you? Everything you dreamed of." Bruce laughed, but there was a touch of melancholy in the sound. "Yes, in some ways. But in others, I left a lot behind." Tim processed his father's words in silence. For the first time, he began to see Bruce as more than the successful man his mother described with a mix of criticism and caution. He seemed human, flawed. It intrigued him. That evening, as Bruce prepared a simple dinner, with the help of an app he admitted he needed to cook, Tim took over. "Let me handle this. You're going to burn the house down," he joked, relaxing for the first time. Bruce laughed, conceding defeat. Tim made pasta with sauce, and they both laughed when Bruce insisted it was the best meal he had ever eaten. "You have a knack for this," Bruce said. "Where did you learn?" "From watching Mom cook," Tim replied without thinking. The comment brought a moment of silence, but the tension quickly passed. Bruce smiled, genuinely. "She's always been amazing at so many things." On Sunday, Bruce had something special planned. He took Tim to his office, a place he usually kept separate from personal relationships. When they arrived, Bruce showed Tim around, including a room he had recently renovated. "This was the first desk I bought when I started the company," Bruce said, pointing to a polished wooden piece in the corner of the room. It was simple, but at the time, it felt like a throne. Tim looked at his father, surprised by the nostalgia in his voice. "Why are you showing me this?" Bruce took a deep breath before answering. "Because I want you to understand that all this success, all this grandeur, doesn't mean much without something deeper. I'm learning that now, and you're part of it." Later, Bruce showed Tim a project his company was developing focused on sustainability. "It was inspired by some of our conversations," Bruce admitted. "It's still small, but it's a start. Maybe you can help me expand it when you finish college." Tim was visibly moved. "Really? You want my help with this?" "I want more than that," Bruce replied, smiling. "I want you to teach me how to do it right." Later that day, father and son went to a baseball game. Bruce admitted he hadn't followed the sport in years but wanted to share something Tim enjoyed. At the stadium, they cheered together, discussed players and strategies. It was a simple but meaningful day. On the way back home, Tim looked at his father. "I didn't expect this weekend to be like this," he confessed. "Neither did I," Bruce replied sincerely. "But I'm glad it was." When Tim returned home, Chloe was waiting in the living room, trying to appear casual. He entered with a quiet smile, something rare in recent days. She didn't ask anything immediately, but he sat next to her on the couch. "It was good," Tim said before she could ask. "He still has a lot to prove, but I think he's trying." Chloe nodded, holding back tears. "That's all that matters. That you're okay." Tim looked at her, realizing how much this meant to her. "Mom, nothing will change between us. You'll always be my foundation." Chloe smiled, finally letting out a sigh of relief. "I know, Tim. And I'm happy for you." The auditorium buzzed with murmurs and anticipation. Family members and friends settled into cushioned chairs, speaking softly as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Chloe adjusted her dress for the third time, trying to ignore the growing anxiety. She knew Bruce would be there. Tim had insisted on inviting his father, and Chloe, reluctantly, agreed. After all, this day was about Tim, and she didn't want her own feelings to get in the way. Bruce arrived shortly after, punctual and discreet. He wore an elegant suit, but his demeanor was more subdued than usual. When he saw Chloe, her heart skipped a beat, not out of affection, but from the tension of sharing such an important moment with someone she still wasn't sure she could trust. He gave her a small smile and waved before sitting beside her. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said softly, adjusting his tie. Chloe responded without taking her eyes off the stage. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for Tim." Bruce nodded, not arguing. He sensed the rigidity in her posture and decided to respect her space. When Tim's name was announced, both of them stood almost simultaneously. Chloe couldn't hold back tears as she watched her son walk confidently onto the stage. He accepted his diploma and looked out at the audience, his smile shining like a beacon. His eyes found Chloe's first, and she felt a wave of pride that almost made her forget the discomfort of sharing this moment with Bruce. Then, Tim looked at his father, and Bruce smiled, clapping enthusiastically. After the ceremony, Tim found them outside. He was beaming, holding his diploma like a trophy. First, he hugged Chloe, leaning down to whisper, "This is for you too, Mom. Thank you for everything." Chloe held back her tears, caressing his face. "You deserve every bit of this, Tim." Then, Tim turned to Bruce. There was a moment of hesitation before he pulled his father into a hug. "Thank you for being here, Dad." The word Dad made Bruce freeze for a moment, but he quickly returned the hug, holding his son tightly. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." That evening, the celebration dinner took place at a cozy restaurant. Tim had invited some friends and professors but reserved the central table for himself and his parents. Chloe and Bruce, seated side by side, maintained polite conversation, but the tension was palpable. Tim, however, seemed determined to bring them together, including them in every anecdote and expression of gratitude. As the dinner wound down, Bruce raised his wine glass for a toast. Clearing his throat, visibly emotional, he began. "I'd like to propose a toast to Tim," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "Today, you showed how incredible you are, not just for what you've achieved but for the person you've become. I'm so proud of you, and it's an honor to be here to celebrate this." The guests applauded, and Tim smiled, clearly moved. Chloe watched Bruce closely during the speech. There was something in his voice that felt genuine, something she hadn't heard in decades. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or steal the moment. He was simply speaking as a father. When Tim's friends began to leave, Chloe and Bruce stayed behind to help tidy up. It was the first time they were alone since Bruce had started reconnecting with Tim. The silence between them was tense but not hostile. "You did well today," Chloe finally said as she folded a napkin. Bruce looked at her, surprised. "I'm just trying to do what I should have done a long time ago." Chloe crossed her arms, studying him for a moment. "I still don't know if I trust you, Bruce. But I can see that Tim is happier, and that's what matters." Bruce nodded, holding her gaze. "I don't expect you to trust me yet. I just hope we can find a way to coexist. For him." Chloe sighed, feeling a weight begin to lift. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a start. "Maybe we can." The wind rustled softly through the trees, and the late afternoon sunlight painted the city in warm golden hues. Tim adjusted the collar of his shirt as he walked toward the entrance of the modern building where he would begin his new job. It was his first day at a sustainable technology company, a dream he'd had since college. The mix of nerves and excitement was written on his face, but above all, there was a glow of determination. Across the street, Chloe watched her son with a quiet smile. Pride was etched into every line of her expression, tinged with a touch of nostalgia. The boy she had raised alone, facing challenges that once seemed insurmountable, was now becoming the man she always knew he could be. It was a moment of fulfillment but also a farewell, as Tim started carving his own path. "He's ready," said a voice behind her. Chloe turned to see Bruce, standing with his hands in his pockets, watching Tim with the same evident pride. "He always was," Chloe replied softly. "He just needed us to step aside." Bruce chuckled, though there was a hint of melancholy in his expression. "You did an incredible job, Chloe. He is who he is because of you. I know I can never make up for what I missed, but I'm grateful you were strong when I wasn't." Chloe looked at Bruce for a moment, considering his words. The anger she had carried for so many years now felt like a distant shadow. She knew Bruce had changed. Not completely, but enough to recognize the genuine effort he was making. "And I'm grateful you came back," she admitted sincerely. "Tim needed that. He needed you." For a few moments, they stood in silence, watching Tim disappear through the building's automatic doors. It was a symbolic moment, not just for their son but for them as well. Despite the pain and mistakes of the past, they had found a way to build something new. Not as a couple, but as partners in Tim's life. "He's going to do great," Bruce said, finally breaking the silence. "He will," Chloe agreed. "He always knew how to." Bruce smiled. "If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." "And the same goes for you," Chloe replied with a small smile. As they each went their separate ways, Chloe felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. The weight of the past, the pain, and the regrets were finally beginning to dissolve. She knew her relationship with Bruce would never be perfect, but it was functional now, built on respect and the shared love they had for Tim. Tim, meanwhile, walked through the halls of his new company with a smile on his face. He knew his parents would never be the traditional family he saw in movies or heard about from friends, but that didn't matter anymore. They had found a way to be present, and that was all he needed. As Tim sat at his new desk, he glanced out the window, where the sky seemed bigger and more open than ever. There was something special about that moment, as if everything had finally fallen into place. He was ready for the future, knowing that no matter what came his way, he had the support of those who mattered most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.